The wind blew steady across the yard, carrying dust that clung to the boards of the fence and stung at the eyes. Dawn had barely broken, casting long shadows across the parched earth of Emmett Callahan's property. The land around his farm had been drying for months each season, tighter than the one before. It was late autumn of 1882, and the ground carried the brittle sound of a place that had gone too long without rain. Emmett drove his shovel into the hard earth muscles, straining against the resistance. Sweat traced lines through the dust on his weathered face, despite the morning chill. His hands, once steady enough to extract bullets from wounded soldiers, now calloused and rough, gripped the wooden handle with determination. Each thrust of the blade felt like penance. The hole was taking shape next to two smaller graves, each marked with simple wooden crosses. Clara and Lily Callahan, wife and daughter, taken by fever 3 winters past. The third grave wasn't for a body, not yet, anyway. It was for the memories that haunted him, the medical instruments he'd packed away the day they died. The remnants of the man he used to be. "You're a fool, Emmett," he muttered to himself, voice rough from disuse. His shovel struck something that wasn't dirt. Frowning, Emmett knelt down, brushing away the soil with his fingers. A scrap of fabric emerged dark with what looked like dried blood. He lifted it carefully, turning it over in his palm. Embroidered on the cloth was a strange symbol, a series of interlocking triangles surrounded by what appeared to be feathers. Emmett stared at it, a chill running up his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Someone had been digging here before him on his land, near his family's graves. The thought kindled a slow anger in his chest. He pocketed the fabric and continued digging more carefully now, searching for anything else hidden beneath the soil. Finding nothing more, he finally placed the wooden box containing his medical instruments in the hole. The brass implements inside had saved countless lives during the war. But they hadn't saved Clara's. They hadn't saved little Lily, with her fever-bright eyes. He began shoveling dirt over the box, burying that part of himself, along with the memories it carried. As the sun climbed higher, Emmett returned to his cabin, a simple structure built with his own hands after the war. Inside, everything was orderly, but spare a table with 2 chairs, though he only ever used one, a narrow bed against the far wall, shelves stocked with basic provisions. The walls were bare, except for a faded photograph of Clara, holding baby Lily, their faces forever frozen in a moment of happiness that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. He washed his hands at the basin, studying the lines etched into them. A doctor's hands, once precise and confident, now just a rancher's, calloused, weathered, and perpetually stained with dirt. He'd kept his world small since the fever took his family. Patch the fences, haul water from the well, keep the livestock alive long enough to push into winter. He didn't go into town unless he had to, and when he did, he spoke only enough words to settle accounts. After a sparse breakfast, Emmett picked up his water bucket and headed toward the barn. His shoulders were stiff from digging, but the work wouldn't wait. The animals needed water, the fence needed mending, and the small crop of corn he'd planted was withering despite his best efforts. His life had narrowed since he buried his wife and daughter. There was no wider plan for him now, only work, silence, and enough food to keep himself breathing from one day into the next. That was his mission, nothing more. He didn't expect surprises. But when Emmett turned the corner of the yard and looked toward the far fence line, his step faltered. At first he thought someone had left refuse there, some bundle of rags or an old coat snagged against the post. Then the shape shifted, and the truth sat heavy in his chest. It wasn't rags. It was a woman. She was chained to his fence with a loop of iron wrist bound high against the post. Her head hung low, dark hair falling forward in strands matted with dust and blood. The torn fabric of her dress clung to her frame, seams ripped open at the neckline and along the skirt. The skin beneath was streaked with dirt and bruises that ran purple and yellow against the bronze of her flesh. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Bare feet pressed into the dirt, scraped raw and bleeding. Emmett stopped a few paces away, his jaw tight. He understood what this meant. Someone had brought her here, settlers or men from town, and fastened her to his land like an animal on display. A message or a test. Either way, if he touched the chain, it became his problem. Deputies might ride out demanding answers. Neighbors might call it harboring, and there was always the chance her own people would come searching, and they would not forgive a white man for standing over her. He stood still for a long moment, weighing it. He told himself to leave her to walk back to the house, pick up the axe, and carry on with the work he had planned. It would be simpler. No questions, no danger. His life had already narrowed to the smallest circle possible, and letting anyone in meant tearing open wounds he had managed to keep closed. The woman stirred slightly, her head lifting just enough for him to see her face. Despite the dirt and blood he could see, she was Apache. Her features were strong, proud, even in her current state. She looked to be in her late 20s, though suffering made age harder to determine. As he studied her, something caught his eye, a mark on her wrist where the iron had cut deep into her skin. Not just bruising, but what appeared to be a tattoo or brand partially visible beneath the blood. Emmett moved closer, curiosity overcoming caution. The woman tensed at his approach but didn't raise her head. When he was close enough to see clearly, his breath caught in his throat. There on her wrist, unmistakable despite the swelling, and blood was the same symbol he'd found on the fabric he'd dug up that morning, interlocking triangles surrounded by feathers. Emmett's heart beat heavy, the way it had the night he lost his family, and could do nothing to stop it. That memory pressed against him now. He could walk away, but he knew the image of her chained to his post would follow him into every night. He had carried enough ghosts. He couldn't add another. He set the bucket down. His hand went to the knife on his belt. The padlock that held the chain was rusted cheap. He worked the blade into the gap and forced the metal until it snapped. The chain slackened, and the sound of it hitting the post was sharp in the silence. The woman staggered forward, her arms falling free. She caught herself on the wood, then pulled her wrists close, rubbing at the red skin where the iron had bitten deep. Emmett saw the marks, the dirt under her fingernails, the tremble in her knees when she tried to stand straight. "Come on," he said, his voice low and flat from disuse. "Need to clean those cuts." She didn't move at first. She only studied him, cautious, measuring what kind of man he was. Emmett felt his throat tighten. He wanted to ask her name, but the words stuck. His life had been quiet for so long that speech itself felt foreign. Instead, he nodded toward the cabin. "Fire inside," he said. She didn't move at first. He could see her weighing it the same way he had weighed cutting the chain. She had no reason to trust him. Men had chained her, beaten her, stripped her dignity away. For her, stepping into another man's cabin was its own kind of risk. But the cold wind pushed at her, and the marks on her wrist spoke of hours without water or food. At last, she shifted slow and deliberate, and took a step toward the cabin. Emmett didn't reach for her. He walked ahead, carrying the bucket, leaving her space to follow or not. He kept his thoughts sharp and steady. He would give her food, give her warmth, then decide what came next. He couldn't see the future past that. Survival was all he had learned to hold on to. Behind him, he heard her bare feet scrape against the dirt as she moved, cautious, but moving all the same. The sound carried heavier than it should have, because it meant the silence of his cabin would not be the same tonight. Emmett pushed the door open and stepped aside, letting the woman enter first. The cabin was plain built years back when he had thought it would hold a family. The air inside carried the smell of wood smoke and iron. Emmett had kept it orderly, not for comfort, but for habit. Now as she stepped across the threshold, he saw the way her eyes moved sharp and hesitant, measuring the space like someone who had learned never to assume safety. She stood near the door, her hands pressed close to her body. Her hair fell loose across her shoulders, strands sticking to her face. She was breathing hard, like the walk from the fence had cost more than she could spare. Her legs shook slightly, but she forced herself upright. Emmett set the bucket down on the table and pulled a tin cup from the shelf. He filled it halfway with water, carried it to her and held it out. She hesitated, watching him, then reached and took it with both hands. Her wrists were raw, the skin swollen where the iron had bitten in. She drank in slow gulps, not spilling a drop, then held the empty cup out again without a word. He refilled it, and she drank once more, slower this time, letting the water steady her. Emmett turned back to the stove. The pot still held beans from the night before, thick and plain, but hot enough. He ladled some into a wooden bowl and placed it on the table, sliding a piece of cornbread beside it. He didn't ask if she wanted it. She didn't sit right away, but the smell drew her closer. She lowered herself onto the chair and picked up the spoon with unsteady fingers. She ate quickly at first, then slowed as if she realized he was watching. Emmett looked away, busying himself with the stove door, though the sound of her spoon scraping the bowl told him enough. When she finished, she set the spoon down and folded her hands in her lap. Her shoulders eased just a little, but her eyes stayed alert, moving from him to the door to the single window that faced the yard. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, studying her in turn. He had questions pressing at him: who had left her there, why they had chosen his fence, whether someone would come looking for her. But he kept them inside. He had lived long enough to know when words did more harm than silence. The woman shifted slightly, adjusting the fabric at her neckline where it had torn. Emmett's eyes caught on something hanging around her neck, a small leather pouch on a cord partially hidden by the torn dress. She noticed his gaze and quickly tucked it back out of sight, one hand protectively covering it. He cleared his throat, walked to the shelf, and pulled down clean rags and a jar of salve he'd made from plants gathered in the hills. He set them on the table before her, then stepped back, giving her space. "For the cuts," he said simply. She looked at the items, then at him. There was a wariness in her eyes, but also a question. Emmett hesitated, then rolled up his sleeve, revealing a long scar on his forearm. He pointed to it, then to the salve. "Works," he said. After a moment, she reached for the jar, opening it to smell the contents. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. She dipped her fingers into the mixture and began applying it to her wounded wrists. Her movements were practiced, familiar with the healing arts. Watching her, Emmett felt an old instinct stir, the need to help, to heal. He pushed it away. That part of him was buried now, along with his instruments and his hope. She finished tending her wounds and looked up at him with dark, assessing eyes. For the first time, she spoke, her voice low but clear-shaped, around an Apache word he didn't understand. The sound of another voice in his cabin, after so long, struck Emmett harder than he expected. He shook his head to indicate he didn't understand. She switched to heavily accented English. Why help? Two simple words that held more weight than they should. Emmett found himself without an easy answer. He looked away toward the photograph on the wall, toward the ghosts he lived with daily. "Doesn't matter," he finally said. "You can stay till you're strong enough to go." She followed his gaze to the photograph, studying it with interest. Then she looked back at him and gave a single solemn nod. The day faded into evening. Emmett kept to his chores inside the cabin, mending tack at the table while she sat by the fire. She didn't speak again, but she watched him work, her eyes sharp with the kind of patience that came from years of survival. When she grew tired, her body sagged against the chair, her eyelids heavy. Emmett stood uncertain what to do. The bed was the only real place to sleep. He could take the floor by the fire. He gestured toward the bed. "You take it. I'll stay here." She didn't answer, only rose slowly, still clutching the salve jar, and crossed the small room. She laid herself down on the bed without pulling the quilt over, as though unsure she had the right. Emmett turned the fire higher, spreading his own blanket on the floorboards. He lay down with his back to the room, staring into the orange glow of the stove. Sleep didn't come easy. His mind kept circling questions. Would men return for her? Would the deputies hear of it and ride out with papers? And what if her people came, instead seeing her in his cabin? Every answer carried risk. But then he remembered the chain around her wrists, the way she had kept her chin down, but her eyes proud. Leaving her would have been easier, but it would have hollowed him out in a way he wasn't willing to face. He turned slightly, looking toward the bed. She was lying on her side, eyes closed, her breathing steady at last. The torn dress still clung to her frame, but her hands were curled around the small leather pouch that hung from her neck, holding it tight against her chest, as though it was the first safe thing she'd touched in days. Emmett let out a slow breath and faced the fire again. The silence of the cabin wasn't the same anymore. For the first time since he buried his family, it felt like someone else was carrying it with him. Morning broke pale through the cracks of the shutters, light spilling in a narrow line across the cabin floor. Emmett had not slept more than a few hours, his body restless on the hard boards near the fire. He rose stiff, pulling on his boots and reaching for his coat. When he turned, he saw that the bed was empty. Panic seized him briefly until he caught sight of a shadow moving outside the window. Quietly, he stepped to the door and opened it. The woman stood in the yard, facing east where the sun was rising. Her arms were raised slightly, palms up toward the light. Her lips moved in what appeared to be a prayer or ritual spoken too softly for him to hear. Despite her injuries, her posture had straightened, drawing strength from the dawn. Emmett watched, feeling like an intruder on something sacred. He stepped back inside, giving her the privacy to finish. When she returned, she seemed startled to find him awake and watching. For a moment, something like embarrassment crossed her face, quickly replaced by her usual wary expression. "Sunrise prayer," she said simply, as if feeling the need to explain. Emmett nodded, acknowledging without prying further. He moved to the stove, adding wood to the fire, the sound of it snapping, filling the silence. As he prepared a simple breakfast, he observed her from the corner of his eye. In the morning light, with some of the dirt washed away, he could see her more clearly. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 28, with features that held a natural dignity despite her circumstances. The bruises on her face and arms told a story of violence, but the way she held herself spoke of someone unbroken. He placed a plate of food before her, corn mush, with a small portion of dried meat. As she ate, he finally asked the question that had been pressing on him. "What's your name?" She paused, spoon halfway to her lips, regarding him with cautious eyes. After a long moment, she answered, "Kimmy." Emmett nodded, committing the sound to memory. "Emmett Callahan," he offered in return. Recognition flashed in her eyes so quick he almost missed it. She knew his name. How was that possible? Before he could ask, she spoke again, her words careful and measured. "Emmett Callahan, Doctor, Union Army." The words hit him like a physical blow. No one here knew of his past as a military surgeon. He'd left that behind, buried it deep, when he came west after the war. How could this Apache woman know? How do you know that? He demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Kimmy's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she rose from the table and moved toward him with deliberate slowness. When she was standing before him, she reached up and touched her own face, tracing a thin scar that ran along her jaw. 5 winters passed, she said. After soldiers attack our village, you heal this. Emmett stared at her, memories rushing back. A military campaign against renegade Apaches, though renegade had meant any who refused to move to the reservation. He'd been called to tend the wounded after a raid went wrong, a raid that wasn't supposed to have women and children present. But they had been there, and the soldiers had fired anyway. He remembered her now, younger, terrified, with a deep gash from a bayonet along her jawline. He had stitched it closed while she stared at him with the same dark, unflinching eyes. He had been gentle, careful with the needle, speaking low words of comfort she couldn't understand. "I remember," he said quietly. Something shifted in her face, a softening around the eyes, the ghost of what might have been a smile in another life. Kimmy not forget the man with gentle hands. The moment hung between them, a connection neither had expected. Then her expression clouded. "Now you bury those hands," she said, gesturing toward the window that faced the graves. "Why?" The question cut to the heart of his pain. Emmett turned away, unable to hold her gaze. They failed when it mattered most. Kimmy followed his gaze to the photograph on the wall. Understanding dawned in her eyes. She didn't offer empty condolences or platitudes. Instead, she moved to the window, looking out toward the graves, and spoke softly in her own language, a prayer, perhaps, or words of respect for the dead. The simple dignity of the gesture touched something in Emmett that had been numb for years. He cleared his throat, fighting back an unexpected wave of emotion. "Who put you on my fence?" he asked, changing the subject. Kimmy's face hardened. "Men from town. Say I steal. Say I kill. Not true." Her hand went to the pouch at her neck. "I come looking." Looking for what? Her eyes met his, measuring, deciding how much to trust him. For justice, for truth. She paused. For family. Before he could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Kimmy tensed, moving away from the window, her body coiling like a spring ready to flee. Emmett moved to the door, peering out carefully. 2 riders were approaching the sheriff and his deputy. His stomach tightened. This was what he'd feared. "Stay inside," he told Kimmy. "Don't make a sound." He stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him, and waited for the riders to reach him. Sheriff Thatcher was an older man, his face weathered by years under the Arizona sun. His deputy was younger, with sharp eyes and a permanent sneer, Malcolm Thatcher, the sheriff's son. "Morning, Callahan," the sheriff called as they reined in their horses. "Been a while since we've seen you in town." Emmett nodded, but didn't reply. He knew better than to offer more words than necessary. Malcolm's eyes scanned the property, searching. "Heard there might have been some trouble out this way." "No trouble," Emmett replied evenly. Sheriff Thatcher dismounted with a grunt, his old bones protesting the movement. "Mind if we water our horses? Rode out early." It was a pretense, and they all knew it. But refusing would only raise suspicion. Emmett gestured toward the trough. "Help yourself." As the sheriff led the horses to water, Malcolm stayed mounted, his gaze fixed on Emmett. "Strange thing happened yesterday. Apache woman we had in custody for killing a settler family, she disappeared. Chain was cut clean through. Emmett kept his face impassive. "That's so. Indeed it is." Malcolm continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "And tracks led this way before we lost them on the hard ground." Emmett shrugged. "Haven't seen any Apache. Just been tending my land." Malcolm's mouth twisted in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll need to have a look around. Standard procedure when hunting a murderer." Every instinct in Emmett told him to refuse, but that would only confirm their suspicions. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the barn. "Nothing there but livestock. Cabins just got me." The sheriff returned, leading the horses. "Appreciate the water, Callahan. Land's drier than I've seen it in years." "Indeed," Emmett replied, glad for the change in subject. "Corn's barely growing." Sheriff Thatcher nodded sympathetically. "Hard times all around. Well, we won't take more of your day. Just keeping an eye out for that Apache woman. Dangerous, she is. Killed a whole family over in Willow Creek, man-wife and their little girl." The words struck Emmett with unexpected force. A family murdered, like an echo of his own loss. He tried to reconcile this with the woman who had prayed at sunrise, who had remembered his kindness from years ago. Could Kimmy truly be capable of such violence? "If I see anything unusual, I'll send word," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. Malcolm's eyes narrowed, studying Emmett's face for any sign of deception. Whatever he saw or didn't see seemed to satisfy him for now. He nodded curtly. "See that you do. We don't take kindly to those who harbor killers." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Emmett met Malcolm's gaze without flinching. "Never been one to break the law, deputy." Sheriff Thatcher mounted his horse with another grunt. "Come on, Malcolm. Callahan's got work to do, and so do we." With a final searching look around the property, the two men turned their horses and rode back toward town. Emmett waited until they were well out of sight before releasing the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When he returned to the cabin, he found Kimmy standing by the back wall, a kitchen knife clutched in her hand, ready to defend herself if needed. "They're gone," he said. Slowly she lowered the knife, but the tension didn't leave her body. "They will come back." "Probably," Emmett agreed. "They say you killed a family. Is that true?" Kimmy's eyes flashed with anger. "No, I not kill. I search for my sister's child. Men take her." The deputy said a family was killed in Willow Creek. Man, woman, and little girl. Kimmy's hand went to the pouch at her neck again, clutching it tightly. "Malcolm Thatcher killed them, not me." Her voice trembled with emotion. "He killed many Apache. 5 winters past, his men attack our village. Same day you heal me." The pieces began falling into place in Emmett's mind. The raid 5 years ago, it had been led by a civilian militia, not regular army. He remembered hearing the name Thatcher mentioned, though he hadn't made the connection until now. Why would he kill a white family? Emmett asked, trying to make sense of it all. Kimmy's expression darkened. "To blame Apache, to give reason to hunt us all." She hesitated, then untied the pouch from around her neck. With reverent care, she opened it and withdrew 2 items, a small lock of dark hair tied with sinew and a piece of cloth, identical to the one Emmett had found that morning, complete with the same symbol. "This, my sister's hair," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This symbol, blood oath. Protection, promise. I swear to find her daughter, my niece." She looked up at him, her eyes burning with intensity. "Men take her. Say she's special. Say she no secret." "What secret?" Kimmy shook her head. "Not tell you yet. Not safe." She returned the items to the pouch and tied it back around her neck. but I know who buries secret on your land." Emmett stared at her realization dawning. "There's something buried by my family's graves. Something beyond what I found this morning." Kimmy nodded solemnly. "Body. Small body." Her voice broke slightly. "Child." The horror of what she was suggesting washed over Emmett like ice water. A child buried in an unmarked grave on his land, hidden there to implicate him, or simply because it was remote enough to remain undiscovered. "Show me," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. Outside, the morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the yard. Kimmy led him to the place where he had been digging. The day before, the spot where he had found the cloth with the symbol. "Here," she said, pointing to the ground. "They bury deep." Emmett retrieved his shovel from the barn and began to dig, his movements fueled by a growing anger. Kimmy stood nearby, her face a mask of grief and determination. As the hole deepened, she began to sing softly a mournful melody in her native tongue that raised goosebumps on Emmett's arms despite the warming day. The shovel struck something solid. Emmett dropped to his knees, brushing away the soil with his hands. A small bundle wrapped in burlap emerged from the earth. With gentle movements that belied his size, he lifted it from the ground. Kimmy's song faltered, her voice catching on a sob. She knelt beside him as he carefully unwrapped the burlap. Inside lay the body of a small Apache girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old. Despite the time in the ground, her features were still recognizable, the same high cheekbones and proud nose that Kimmy possessed. Around her neck was a silver pendant with the same symbol as the cloth. "My sister's child," Kimmy whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Little dove." Emmett's medical training allowed him to see what others might miss: the clean cut across the child's throat, made with a sharp blade. This was no accident, no death from disease. This was murder, deliberate and calculated. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate against such grief. Kimmy reached out with trembling fingers to touch the child's face. "Not her," she said, her voice suddenly stronger. "Sister have 2 daughters, twins. This one is Little Dove. Other one is Star Walker. She's still alive. I feel it." She removed the pendant from around the child's neck and added it to her pouch. "Now I have both signs. Must find Star Walker before they kill her too." Emmett sat back on his heels, his mind racing. Why would they kill one child and keep the other? Kimmy's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of grief and determination. Star Walker special. She born with blue eyes like sky, half-blood. Father was soldier like you. She paused. She know where sacred water flows beneath desert, where gold hides in mountain. They want her to show. The implications were clear. A mixed-race child with knowledge of natural resources would be valuable to men like Malcolm Thatcher, men who saw the land only for what could be extracted from it. "And they buried her sister here on my land," Emmett said slowly. "Why?" "To hide truth," Kimmy replied. "To make ghost fear you. To make you never dig." She looked at him with new understanding. "But you dig anyway. You not afraid of ghosts." "I live with them every day," he said quietly. They wrapped Little Dove's body back in the burlap, but with added care, Kimmy lined it with sweet-smelling herbs she gathered from near the house. Emmett dug a proper grave deeper than before next to his own family. As he worked, Kimmy sang her death songs, her voice carrying across the barren land. When the child was laid to rest, Kimmy performed the funeral rites of her people, while Emmett stood respectfully aside. He watched her movements, the dignity with which she honored the dead, and felt something stir within him, admiration perhaps, or recognition of a shared understanding of loss. As they walked back to the cabin, Emmett made a decision. "You can stay here until you're strong enough to travel. I won't tell anyone I've seen you." Kimmy stopped studying his face. "Why you help? They say I kill. Could bring trouble." Emmett looked back at the three graves now standing together, his wife, his daughter, and now this Apache child. "Because I buried my doctoring with my family. Maybe I was wrong to do that." Her eyes softened with understanding. She reached out hesitantly, then withdrew her hand before touching him. "Healing hands should heal," she said simply. That afternoon, Emmett brought up a loose floorboard in the cabin, revealing a small space beneath where he kept valuables and emergency supplies. He added a revolver and box of ammunition, then covered it again. If trouble came, he would be ready. Kimmy observed this without comment, but he could see approval in her eyes. Later, as dusk settled over the land, she helped him prepare a simple meal. Her movements were efficient, despite her injuries revealing training in domestic tasks, alongside her obvious survival skills. They ate in companionable silence, the tension of the morning's discoveries settling into a quiet determination. When darkness fell completely, Emmett lit the lamp and returned to his mending, while Kimmy sat by the fire lost in thought. "Tomorrow I will help with work," she said suddenly, "to repay shelter." Emmett looked up from his task. "You should rest. Heal first." Kimmy shook her head firmly. "Kimmy not weak. Can work. Will work." She met his gaze directly. "Apache not take charity. Give back what is given." He recognized the pride in her words, the need to maintain dignity even in desperate circumstances. It reminded him of his own stubborn self-reliance after Clara and Lily died. "All right," he conceded, "but nothing too heavy until those wrists heal." She nodded, satisfied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, "Thank you for little dove, for respect." The simple gratitude touched him more deeply than he expected. Emmett nodded, not trusting himself to speak. That night, as they prepared for sleep, Kimmy once again took the bed, while Emmett made his place by the fire. As he stared into the flames, his thoughts turned to the scrap of fabric he'd found, to the child buried near his family, to the men who had chained Kimmy to his fence. Nothing in his quiet existence had prepared him for this. Yet something about Kimmy's presence, about her quiet determination in the face of overwhelming loss, resonated with him. Perhaps they were not so different after all, both carrying grief, both seeking some form of redemption. As sleep finally claimed him, Emmett's last thought was of the medical instruments he'd buried, and whether it was time to unearth them along with the man he used to be. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. True to her word, Kimmy began helping with the daily chores as her strength returned. She proved remarkably knowledgeable about desert plants, showing Emmett which ones could be eaten, which had medicinal properties, and which might help his struggling crops survive the drought. One morning, she led him to a dry creek bed half a mile from the cabin. Kneeling, she pressed her ear to the ground, listening intently. Then she moved several yards upstream and began digging with her hands. Emmett watched puzzled until water began seeping into the hole she'd created. "Underground stream," she explained. "Not gone, just hidden. Dig deeper, make small dam water will come." With Emmett's help, they enlarged the hole and reinforced it with stones. By midday, they had created a small but steady water source, not enough to save all his crops, but sufficient to keep the most essential plants alive. "How did you know?" he asked as they rested in the shade. Kimmy's expression was serious. "My people live here many generations. Know where water hides." She paused. her eyes measuring him. This what Starwalker know but more. She see water beneath ground like hawk, see rabbit from sky. A gift, Emmett murmured. Gift become curse when wrong people know, she replied sadly. As they walked back to the cabin, Emmett noticed Kimmy occasionally scanning the horizon, her eyes alert for any sign of pursuit. The fear never fully left her, despite the growing ease between them. Each night, she performed her rituals prayers at sunset, the careful tending of Little Dove's grave quiet songs in her native tongue that drifted through the cabin like smoke. Gradually, Emmett found himself talking more than he had in years. Simple sentences, at first instructions about tasks, comments on the weather. But eventually prompted by Kimmy's quiet questions, he spoke of Clara and Lily, of the fever that had taken them while he was in town getting supplies. 3 days, he said one evening as they sat by the fire. I was gone 3 days. When I returned, Clara was already delirious. Lily was burning with fever. I tried everything I knew. His voice faltered. Nothing worked. My knowledge, my training useless. Kimmy listened without interruption, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. When he fell silent, she spoke softly. Great sickness come to my people too. Many die. Strongest medicine, not always enough. She held his gaze steadily. Not your fault, Emmett Callahan. The words should have been a comfort, but they struck him like physical blows. He had told himself the same thing countless times, yet never believed it. Somehow hearing it from this woman who had lost so much herself, yet continued to fight, made the possibility of acceptance seem more real. That night, a thunderstorm rolled across the desert. Lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the small cabin. Emmett, unable to sleep, noticed Kimmy sitting upright in the bed, her body rigid with fear. Each crack of thunder made her flinch, her hands clutching the leather pouch at her neck. Without thinking, he moved to sit on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. My wife was afraid of storms, too, he said quietly. Kimmy's eyes found his in the darkness. Apache believe thunder is voice of powerful spirits, sometimes angry. She winced as another boom rattled the windows. During raid, when soldiers come, sky spoke with fire, that day too. Understanding dawned on Emmett. The storm was triggering memories of the attack on her village. He remained still, offering silent companionship as the storm raged outside. Neither spoke, but something shifted between them, a deepening of trust, perhaps, or recognition of shared vulnerability. As the thunder gradually moved away, and the rain settled into a steady patter on the roof, Kimmy's tension eased. She lay back down, but kept her eyes on Emmett. Your wife, she said softly. What was her name? Clara, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. And our daughter was Lily. Kimmy nodded solemnly. Good names, strong like flowers that survive in hard places. She hesitated, then added, My sister's name was Morning Sky. She died trying to save daughters. The simple exchange, the sharing of names of those most precious to them, felt like a sacred act in the storm-darkened cabin. Emmett returned to his place by the fire, but sleep eluded him long into the night. The walls he had built around his heart since Clara and Lily died felt less solid, somehow weathered by Kimmy's quiet presence. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the desert briefly transformed by the rain. As Emmett stepped outside, he found Kimmy already at work, examining his small garden where new green shoots pushed through the soil. Rain bring life, she said, looking up at his approach, but need more than one storm to heal dry land. Her words seemed to carry a deeper meaning than just agricultural advice. Emmett nodded, understanding more than she had directly stated. That afternoon, as they worked together repairing a section of fence damaged by the storm, Kimmy suddenly froze. Emmett followed her gaze and saw dust rising in the distance, riders approaching. "Inside," he said urgently. "Use the space beneath the floor, if needed." Kimmy moved swiftly toward the cabin but paused at the door. "Be careful, Emmett Callahan. Malcolm Thatcher has Snake's heart." Before he could respond, she disappeared inside. Emmett turned to face the approaching riders, his hand instinctively checking the knife at his belt. As they drew closer, he recognized the sheriff and his son, accompanied by two other men he didn't know. "Callahan," Sheriff Thatcher called as they reined in their horses. "Got a minute?" Emmett nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Sheriff?" Malcolm dismounted, his eyes scanning the property with predatory intensity. "Looks like you got some rain last night." "Some," Emmett agreed, watching as the two strangers also dismounted. They had the hard look of men who made their living with guns. Sheriff Thatcher remained on his horse, looking uncomfortable. "We're still looking for that Apache woman. Trail's gone cold with the rain, but we have reason to believe she might be in this area." "Haven't seen anyone," Emmett replied evenly. Malcolm's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if we have another look around, more thorough this time?" It wasn't really a question. Emmett shrugged. "Nothing to hide." The two strangers moved toward the barn, while Malcolm approached the cabin. Emmett followed, his pulse quickening. Inside the cabin appeared empty. Malcolm walked around the small space, tapping on walls, looking under the bed. "Simple life you've carved out here, Callahan," he commented. "Lonely, though, I'd imagine." Emmett didn't respond, watching as Malcolm examined the stove, the shelves, the table. "Two bowls," Malcolm noted, picking up the dishes from that morning's breakfast that Emmett hadn't yet washed. "Expecting company. One for beans, one for coffee," Emmett replied without hesitation. Malcolm studied him, skepticism clear in his expression. His gaze drifted to the floor, and for a heart-stopping moment, Emmett thought he noticed the slightly uneven board that concealed the hiding space. But then his attention was drawn to something else, the photograph on the wall. "Your family?" he asked, moving closer to examine it. "Yes." "Pretty woman," Malcolm observed. "Shame about the fever. Town still talks about it, how the doctor couldn't save his own family." The deliberate cruelty of the words hit their mark. Emmett's hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his face impassive. "That old deputy?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Malcolm turned a satisfied look in his eyes at having found a vulnerable spot. "For now." Outside, the two strangers emerged from the barn, shaking their heads to indicate they'd found nothing. Sheriff Thatcher seemed relieved. "Well, we'll be on our way then, Callahan. Sorry to trouble you." Malcolm mounted his horse, but his eyes remained fixed on Emmett. "We'll find her eventually. Apaches leave tracks even after rain." He smiled coldly. "When we do, anyone who's helped her will answer to me personally." The threat hung in the air as they rode away. Emmett waited until they were out of sight before returning to the cabin. He found Kimmy emerging from beneath the floorboard's dust, clinging to her hair and clothes. "They gone?" she asked, her voice tense. "For now," Emmett confirmed. "But they'll be back." Kimmy brushed the dust from her clothes, her movements quick and agitated. "Not safe here anymore. I should go." "And go where?" Emmett challenged. "They're watching all the trails, especially now that they suspect something." She paced the small cabin, her anxiety palpable. "Malcolm knows. He see two bowls. He smell my presence." "Maybe," Emmett conceded, "but rushing out without a plan is suicide." Kimmy stopped her pacing, fixing him with an intense gaze. "Why you risk for me? They could take your land, put you in jail." Why? It was a question Emmett had been asking himself since the moment he cut her chains. The answer came to him now with unexpected clarity. Because for 3 years I've been half alive. Breathing, working, existing, but not living. He looked toward the photograph of Clara and Lily. They wouldn't want that for me. And that little girl deserves justice, same as any child. Something shifted in Kimmy's expression, a softening, a deepening of respect. She approached slowly and for the first time reached out to touch his arm, a brief, gentle contact that spoke volumes. "Then we make plan," she said firmly. Together. That evening, as darkness fell, they discussed their options in low voices. Kimmy believed her niece Starwalker was being held at a ranch owned by a wealthy man named Henderson, an associate of Malcolm Thatcher's. The ranch lay 2 days' ride to the north in a valley surrounded by rugged hills. "How do you know she's there?" Emmett asked. Kimmy's hand went to her pouch. "Blood oath. Sisters share special connection. When morning sky die, her spirit show me where child hidden." She met his skeptical gaze without flinching. "You have your faith, I have mine." Emmett couldn't argue with that. "Even if you're right, a 2-man ranch owned by Henderson would be heavily guarded. We'd need help." "Apache warriors would come," Kimmy said, "if I could reach them. Sierra Blanca's band still free in mountains north." The plan began taking shape between them, find a way to contact the Apache band, locate Starwalker, and expose Malcolm Thatcher's crimes. It was dangerous, perhaps impossible, but for the first time in years, Emmett felt something stirring within him. Purpose, determination, the will to fight for something beyond mere survival. As they talked late into the night, the distance between them, cultural, experiential, seemed to narrow. Here were 2 people who had lost everything, now united by a common cause and a growing trust. When they finally prepared for sleep, Kimmy paused by the bed. "Emmett Callahan," she said softly, "tomorrow I show you something. Important thing." Curious, he nodded. "What is it?" Her expression was solemn in the lamplight. "The reason Starwalker so important. The reason for blood oath." She touched the leather pouch at her neck. "The reason they kill Little Dove." With that cryptic promise, she lay down to sleep, leaving Emmett to wonder what revelation morning would bring. Outside the desert, night was alive with sounds, coyotes calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through dry grass, the occasional hoot of an owl. Emmett lay awake listening, thinking of the path that had led him here and the uncertain road ahead. For the first time since he had buried Clara and Lily, tomorrow mattered for more than just survival. Tomorrow held the possibility of purpose, of justice, perhaps even redemption. The thought followed him into sleep, a small flame of hope in the darkness that had been his life for too long. Dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the desert in hues of amber and gold. Emmett woke early, his body stiff from another night on the hard floor, but his mind clearer than it had been in years. He found Kimmy already awake, kneeling by the fireplace, coaxing the embers back to life with practiced movements. She looked up as he rose, acknowledging him with a slight nod. "Morning comes," she said simply. "That it does," Emmett replied, stretching his tired muscles. They shared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried meat. As they ate, Emmett noticed Kimmy's demeanor had shifted. There was a new tension in her shoulders, a gravity in her expression that spoke of important matters to come. "You said you would show me something today," he prompted gently. Kimmy set her bowl aside and fixed him with an intense gaze. "Yes, but first you must understand Apache ways." She touched the leather pouch at her neck. "Blood oath is sacred. To break is to die worse than death, to wander forever without peace." The solemnity in her voice made it clear she wasn't speaking metaphorically. Emmett nodded, respecting the weight of her beliefs. "I understand," he said. She studied his face, searching for sincerity. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. "Come," she said, rising. "Must go to hills. Not safe to speak of sacred things, near walls that hear." Emmett raised an eyebrow at this, but didn't question her caution. After the visit from Malcolm and his men yesterday, perhaps her paranoia was justified. They left the cabin and headed east, toward a cluster of low hills that marked the edge of Emmett's property. Kimmy moved with quiet confidence, her footsteps leaving barely a trace on the ground. Emmett followed, scanning the horizon regularly for any sign of riders or trouble. The sun climbed higher as they walked, its heat intensifying. Sweat beaded on Emmett's forehead, but Kimmy showed no signs of discomfort, her body accustomed to the desert's harsh embrace. She led him up a narrow path that wound between rocky outcroppings until they reached a small plateau. Before them stretched a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape, Emmett's modest farm below, the vast expanse of desert beyond, and in the far distance the purple shadows of mountains. Kimmy pointed north, toward those distant peaks. There, Sierra Blanca's people, hidden valleys where white men not find. She turned to face west, toward a dark line that marked a river valley. There, Henderson Ranch, where Starwalker held prisoner. Her voice tightened. Where they force her to find water, find gold. Emmett squinted against the sunlight, trying to make out details at such a distance. "You've been watching a long time," he observed. Kimmy nodded, her expression grim. "Many moons. Follow Malcolm Thatcher. Learn his ways. Learn who works with him." Her eyes met his. "Learn about you, Emmett Callahan." The revelation shouldn't have surprised him, but it did. "You've been watching me, why?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt and began clearing a small patch of ground, brushing away loose stones until she had created a smooth area of bare earth. From her pouch, she withdrew a handful of colored powder, ochre, red, and white, and began to trace patterns on the ground. "When sister die, she give me vision," Kimmy explained as she worked. "Show me man who save Kimmy's life, man with healing hands, man who bury his power with his family." She glanced up at him. "You." Emmett watched as the pattern took shape beneath her fingers, concentric circles with lines radiating outward, similar to the symbol on the cloth he had found. "The vision showed you where to find me?" he asked, skepticism evident in his voice. "Vision show path, Kimmy follow." She continued drawing, adding smaller symbols between the lines. "Vision also show this, the sacred map." The pattern was, indeed, beginning to resemble a map, with features that corresponded to the landscape spread before them. Kimmy pointed to various markings explaining their significance. "Here your land, here town, here Henderson Ranch." She traced a line that wound from the mountains down toward the river valley. "And here what they seek, agua sagrada, sacred water." Emmett knelt beside her for a better look. "What exactly is this sacred water?" Kimmy's voice lowered, though there was no one else for miles to hear. "In driest land, deep beneath ground, great river flows. Pure, cold, endless." She drew another series of symbols. "Where river touches surface, healing springs form. Where river runs near earth's fire, gold forms." The implications were clear. In a land where water was more precious than gold, an underground river would be invaluable both for its life-giving properties and for the minerals it might contain. "And your niece can find this water?" Emmett asked. Kimmy nodded solemnly. "Starwalker born with gift. She feel water beneath ground, like hawk feel wind beneath wings." Pride mingled with sorrow in her voice. "Mother teach her to hide gift. Too dangerous if wrong people know." "But someone found out," Emmett surmised. Trader, come to village. Bring goods, take furs. See Starwalker find water for crops. Kimmy's face hardened. Trader, tell Malcolm Thatcher. Malcolm, come with men, take both children. Kill everyone else. She fell silent, her hand hovering over the map she had drawn. The memory of that day was clearly etched into her being, a wound that had never properly healed. Why kill one child and keep the other? Emmett asked, voicing the question that had bothered him since they found Little Dove's body. Kimmy's expression darkened. Little Dove bite Malcolm's hand when he tried to take her sister. So she made a slashing gesture across her throat, unable to speak the words aloud. To teach Starwalker to obey. The brutal calculation of such an act left Emmett cold. He had seen violence in the war, had treated wounds inflicted by man upon man, but the deliberate murder of a child to control another spoke of a darkness beyond ordinary cruelty. And they buried her on my land to hide the evidence, he said, anger building in his chest. Yes, and to put blame on you if body found. Kimmy met his gaze directly. Malcolm Thatcher, clever like snake, always plan ahead. She brushed her hand across the map, erasing it with a sweep of her palm. Now you understand what we fight for. Not just one child, but sacred knowledge. Water that gives life to desert. Emmett thought of the dying crops on his small farm, of the struggling ranches throughout the territory, of the tension between settlers and native people over increasingly scarce resources. If Malcolm and his associates gained control of a hidden water source, they would hold power over the entire region. So your plan is to reach Sierra Blanca's band, gather warriors, and raid Henderson's ranch to rescue your niece. Emmett summarized, thinking through the logistics. That's a lot of firepower and risk for one child. Kimmy's eyes flashed. Not just for child, for future, for balance. She stood brushing the colored powder from her hands. Apache believe water belongs to all living things, not to one man who puts name on paper. It was a fundamental difference in worldview that Emmett had encountered before the concept of land and resources as communal rather than private property. He didn't entirely disagree, especially when it came to water. Henderson and Malcolm won't give up easily, he warned. They'll have men with guns. Apache warriors have guns too, Kimmy replied. And know land better. Emmett rose to stand beside her, gazing out over the vast landscape. The plan was dangerous, perhaps foolhardy, but he found himself unable to suggest abandoning it. Something about Kimmy's determination about the justice she sought resonated deep within him. I buried my medical instruments yesterday, he said after a long moment. Maybe it's time to dig them up again. Kimmy studied his face, understanding the deeper meaning of his words. A slow, solemn nod was her only response, but it carried the weight of a covenant between them. They started back down the hill, each lost in their own thoughts. Halfway to the cabin, Kimmy suddenly froze, her head tilting as she listened intently. "Riders," she whispered, dropping into a crouch. Emmett strained his ears and caught it too, the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. Without a word, they changed course, circling around to approach the cabin from behind. Moving swiftly but cautiously, they reached the back of the barn just as 3 riders came into view at the front of the property. Through a gap in the weathered boards, Emmett could see Malcolm Thatcher and the same 2 hard-faced men from the day before. There was no sign of the sheriff this time. "Stay here," he murmured to Kimmy. "If things go wrong, run for the hills. Don't try to help me." Before she could protest, he stepped out from behind the barn and walked calmly toward the approaching riders, keeping his hands visible. "Thatcher," he called in, greeting his voice neutral, Back so soon? Malcolm reined in his horse, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Callahan, just passing through. The casual tone didn't match the tension in his posture. Thought I'd check if you'd seen anything unusual since yesterday. Just jackrabbits and coyotes, Emmett replied evenly. And you three, of course. A tight smile crossed Malcolm's face. Funny. He dismounted, handing his reins to one of his companions. Mind if I have another look around, just to be thorough? It wasn't really a question. Emmett shrugged, maintaining his calm facade despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. Where was the sheriff? Why had Malcolm returned so quickly? Help yourself, he said, though I can't imagine what you think you'll find today that you didn't find yesterday. Malcolm's smile didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I have a feeling there's more here than meets the eye. He gestured to his companions. Jenkins, check the barn again. Reeves, take the south field. As the men dismounted and moved off to follow orders, Malcolm approached Emmett with deliberate slowness. You know, Callahan, I've been thinking about you, he said conversationally. Former Union Army doctor settled out here all alone after losing your family. Keeps to himself, barely comes to town. He circled Emmett like a predator. Strikes me as the kind of man who might have secrets. Emmett kept his expression neutral. No secrets, deputy. Just prefer my own company. Malcolm stopped directly in front of him, close enough that Emmett could smell the tobacco on his breath. See, that's what you say. But this morning, one of my men found something interesting out by the creek. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it up between them. It was a moccasin bead intricately decorated in an Apache pattern, one that had likely come loose from Kimmy's clothing during their water-finding expedition the day before. Apache craftsmanship, Malcolm said, watching Emmett's face carefully for any reaction. Fresh, too. Not weathered enough to have been out there long. Emmett kept his expression impassive, though his mind raced. Plenty of Apache pass through these parts, or used to before you started hunting them. Something dangerous flashed in Malcolm's eyes. Careful, Callahan. That sounds dangerously close to sympathy for savages. I've treated men of all kinds, Emmett replied, holding his ground. Found them mostly the same under the skin. Malcolm pocketed the bead, his hand lingering near his holstered pistol. Well, that's where you and I differ. Some men deserve respect, others need to be put in their place. He leaned closer. And those who help our enemies deserve whatever comes their way. The threat hung in the air between them, unmistakable. Emmett said nothing, meeting Malcolm's gaze steadily. After a tense moment, Malcolm stepped back. Jenkins, Reeves, he called. Anything. The two men returned, shaking their heads. Nothing in the barn, boss, Jenkins reported. Southfield's clear, too, added Reeves. But there's a fresh grave out by the family plot. Looks recent. Malcolm's attention snapped back to Emmett, his eyes narrowing. A fresh grave. Who died? Callahan. Emmett's mind worked quickly. Buried my past, he said, the partial truth coming easily. Medical instruments, mementos from before. Didn't want them anymore. Malcolm studied him, skepticism written across his features. Mind if we have a look at this grave? It's private, Emmett replied, an edge entering his voice. Family ground. This is official business. Malcolm countered, his hand now resting openly on his pistol. And I say we're going to have a look. Emmett's muscles tensed, preparing for conflict. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but if it came to a fight, he wouldn't go down easily. Before the situation could escalate further, a new sound caught their attention. Hoofbeats approaching rapidly from the direction of town. All heads turned to see the sheriff riding hard toward them, dust billowing behind his horse. Sheriff Thatcher pulled up sharply, his face flushed with exertion and anger. "Malcolm!" he barked. "What the hell are you doing out here? I told you to wait for me." Malcolm's expression flickered with annoyance, but he quickly masked it. "Just following a lead, Pa. Found Apache sign on Callahan's property." The sheriff dismounted, his movements stiff with age and irritation. "One bead doesn't constitute Apache sign, son." He turned to Emmett, his manner gruff but less hostile than his son's. "Sorry about this, Callahan. Sometimes my deputy gets overeager." Emmett nodded, cautiously aware that the situation remained volatile despite the sheriff's arrival. "No harm done, yet." The pointed addition wasn't lost on Sheriff Thatcher, who shot his son a warning look. "We'll be on our way then. Come on, Malcolm." For a moment, it seemed Malcolm might refuse. His eyes burned with frustrated anger, and his hand still hovered near his weapon. But after a tense standoff, he nodded curtly and moved back to his horse. "This isn't finished, Callahan," he said quietly as he mounted. "Not by a long shot." The four riders departed, Malcolm and his men radiating resentment, while the sheriff rode slightly apart, his posture suggesting an internal conflict. Emmett watched them until they disappeared over the rise, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Kimmy emerged from her hiding place, her expression grim. "They suspect," she said. "Not safe here anymore." Emmett nodded in agreement. "We need to move up our timeline. Malcolm will be back probably tonight, and next time the sheriff might not intervene." They returned to the cabin, quickly gathering only essential supplies. Food, water, a few tools, Emmett's revolver, and ammunition. As Kimmy packed these into a makeshift bundle, Emmett went to the small grave where he had buried his medical instruments just days ago. The earth was still loose, making it easy to uncover the wooden box. He brushed away the dirt, feeling a strange mixture of trepidation and purpose as he lifted the lid. Inside, the brass and steel instruments gleamed in the sunlight, scalpels, forceps, needles, and more. Tools that had saved lives and failed to save the ones that mattered most to him. Emmett's hands trembled slightly as he picked up a scalpel. Memories flooded back, the chaos of field hospitals during the war, the quiet competence he had developed through years of practice, the desperate attempts to save Clara and Lily as fever ravaged their bodies. Healing hands should heal, Kimmy had said. Perhaps it was time to find out if that was still true. He wrapped the instruments carefully in a clean cloth and returned to the cabin where Kimmy waited. Without words, they understood the urgency of their situation. Within an hour, they had gathered everything they needed and were ready to depart. Emmett took one last look around the cabin that had been his home for years. His eyes lingered on the photograph of Clara and Lily, the only personal possession he couldn't bring himself to leave behind. He carefully removed it from the wall and tucked it inside his shirt, close to his heart. "They would be proud," Kimmy said softly, observing the gesture. "To see you fight for child, not your own." The simple statement touched something deep within him. Emmett nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. They left through the back door, keeping to areas of hard ground where they would leave minimal tracks. Kimmy led the way, her knowledge of the landscape guiding them toward paths that would be difficult to follow. Their destination was the hills to the northeast, where they might find a way to contact Sierra Blanca's band. As they traveled, Emmett found himself watching Kimmy with growing admiration. Despite her recent injuries and captivity, she moved with a fluid strength, her body attuned to the harsh environment in ways his would never be. When they paused to rest, she showed him how to find water in seemingly dry places, how to move without disturbing the wildlife, how to read the subtle signs of the desert. By late afternoon, they had reached the hills and found a small cave that offered shelter and a defensible position. As Kimmy gathered wood for a small, smokeless fire, Emmett climbed to a vantage point where he could watch for pursuers. The desert stretched out below, shimmering in the heat, with his small farm visible in the distance. No riders appeared on the horizon, but Emmett harbored no illusions about their safety. Malcolm Thatcher would not give up easily, especially now that his suspicions had been aroused. They would need to keep moving come morning. When he returned to the cave, Kimmy had started a fire so small it produced almost no smoke, yet gave enough heat to warm their shelter. She was sitting cross-legged before it, her eyes closed in what appeared to be meditation or prayer. Not wanting to disturb her, Emmett busied himself with organizing their supplies and checking his revolver. The weapon was old but reliable, a Colt Army model that had served him during the war. He had 6 bullets, plus the 12 in his pouch, not nearly enough if they faced multiple opponents. "Tonight I call to spirits," Kimmy said, suddenly opening her eyes. "Ask them to carry message to Sierra Blanca." Emmett looked up from his weapon. "Spirits?" he echoed skeptically. A faint smile touched her lips. "Not just spirits. Smoke signals at dawn from highest point. Apache watch hills always. We'll see." "And what if Malcolm's men see them too?" Emmett asked. "Different signals look same to those who not know meaning," she replied. "White men see smoke, think campfire. Apache see smoke, read words." It was a practical solution, though not without risk. Emmett nodded his acceptance of the plan. "And if they respond, we meet tomorrow at Sacred Place." Kimmy gestured toward a distinctive rock formation visible on a distant ridge. "Place known to all Apache, but not to white men." As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. The small fire provided minimal warmth, and they sat close together out of necessity rather than choice. Emmett found the proximity both uncomfortable and strangely comforting. It had been years since he had been this close to another person for any length of time. Kimmy seemed lost in thought, her fingers absently touching the leather pouch at her neck. The firelight cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting the proud lines of her cheekbones and the strength in her jaw. Despite the hardships she had endured, there was a dignity to her that remained unbroken. "Why did you become healer?" she asked suddenly, her dark eyes finding his across the small space. The unexpected question caught Emmett off guard. He hadn't spoken of his path to medicine in years. "My father was a doctor," he said after a moment. "Taught me from childhood. Seemed natural to follow him." Kimmy nodded, considering this. "In my people, healers chosen by spirits. Show signs as children, dreams, visions, special understanding of plants and animals." She studied him curiously. "You have such signs." Emmett almost smiled at the thought. "No visions, just a steady hand and a good memory for anatomy." He paused, remembering. "Though I did have a knack for diagnosis, seeing patterns others missed, sensing what was wrong before the obvious symptoms appeared." "That is spirit gift," Kimmy said with conviction. "Different name, same power." Rather than argue the point, Emmett asked a question of his own. "And you, are you a healer among your people?" A shadow passed over her face. "Was learning. Sister was great healer. Teaching me, teaching daughters." Her voice lowered. "Now I last of family. Must carry knowledge, must save Star Walker." The weight of responsibility in her voice was palpable. Emmett understood it all too well, the burden of being the one left behind, the one who must carry on. "We'll find her," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Kimmy's eyes met his, searching for truth. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, for she nodded solemnly, a silent pact between them. They ate a sparse meal of dried meat and cornbread, conserving their limited supplies. As the night deepened, the sounds of the desert surrounded them, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through rocks. Kimmy unfolded a small bundle she had carried from the cabin, revealing a collection of herbs and powders. With practiced movements, she began to prepare for the ritual she had mentioned, grinding some plants between stones, mixing others with a small amount of water. "Tonight I journey in spirit," she explained, noticing Emmett's curious gaze. "Seek guidance, seek strength." She hesitated, then added, "Will be like sleep, but deeper. If danger comes," she mimed, shaking someone awake. Emmett nodded his understanding. "I'll keep watch." Kimmy continued her preparations, her movements becoming increasingly ritualistic. She used some of the powders to draw symbols on the cave floor, similar to the map she had shown him earlier, but with additional markings he didn't recognize. Finally, she sat cross-legged within the circle of symbols, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. She began to sing softly a melodic chant that rose and fell like the desert wind. The strange beauty of it caught Emmett by surprise, reminding him that there was more to this woman than the warrior and survivor he had come to know. As her singing continued, Kimmy's eyes slowly closed. Her breathing deepened and slowed until it was barely perceptible. To all appearances, she had entered a trance state, just as she had described. Emmett watched for a few minutes, fascination warring with his medical skepticism. Then, true to his word, he moved to the mouth of the cave to keep watch, his revolver close at hand. The night stretched long before him, filled with unfamiliar stars and the weight of decisions that could not be undone. The hours passed slowly. Emmett maintained his vigil, alert for any sign of pursuit. Occasionally, he would check on Kimmy, who remained motionless in her trance, her breathing so shallow it was barely visible. Around midnight, as the moon reached its zenith, a soft sound from within the cave drew his attention. Kimmy's chanting had resumed, though different now, more urgent, almost distressed. Her face was tense, her body rigid, despite her seated position. Concerned, Emmett moved closer. Should he wake her, as she had instructed, if danger threatened? But the danger seemed to be within her mind, not outside in the physical world. Before he could decide, Kimmy's eyes flew open wide and disoriented. A gasp escaped her lips, and she clutched at the leather pouch around her neck with desperate intensity. "Kimmy," Emmett said softly, keeping his distance. "Are you all right?" For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him. Then awareness returned to her eyes, along with a haunted expression that hadn't been there before. "I see her," Kimmy whispered, her voice hoarse. "Star Walker. She alive, but—" Her voice broke. "They hurt her spirit, force her to find water for Henderson's cattle, for his gold mine." Emmett crouched beside her, offering his canteen. "Did you see where they're keeping her exactly?" Kimmy drank deeply, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Building of stone. Underground. Beneath main house." Her hands trembled slightly. "Many guards. Dogs." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with urgency. "We must hurry. Her spirit fades." The medical professional in Emmett wanted to dismiss this as superstition or the product of an emotionally charged dream. But the certainty in Kimmy's voice, the specific details she provided, these were harder to explain away. "We'll leave at first light," he promised. "Make the signal, then head for the meeting place." Kimmy nodded, some of the tension leaving her body. She remained seated within her circle of symbols, but now she reached for her bundle of herbs again. With practiced movements, she mixed a new preparation, then used her fingers to apply it to her temples and the center of her forehead. "For protection," she explained, offering some to Emmett. "Against spirits that follow from dark places." Hesitantly, He accepted more out of respect for her beliefs than any conviction of his own. The mixture smelled of sage and something else he couldn't identify, sharp and earthy at the same time. They settled back into silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Emmett returned to his position at the cave entrance, but found his mind turning over Kimmy's vision repeatedly. What if she was right? What if her niece truly was being held underground, forced to use her mysterious gift to locate water and gold? The rational part of his mind rebelled against such supernatural explanations. Yet, he had seen enough in his life, both during the war and after, to know that there were things beyond his understanding. The connection between twins, for instance, which he had observed in patients more than once. The uncanny way some people could predict changes in weather or find water where none was apparent. Perhaps Kimmy's spirit journey was simply her mind's way of processing information she had gathered through observation and intuition. Or perhaps there truly was something more at work, something his medical training hadn't prepared him to comprehend. Either way, their course was clear. They would continue with their plan, seek out Sierra Blanca's band, and find a way to rescue Starwalker from Henderson's ranch. The why and how of Kimmy's knowledge mattered less than the action they would take because of it. Dawn approached with a gradual lightening of the eastern sky. Kimmy stirred from her meditative state, rising with fluid grace, despite having sat motionless for hours. Without a word, she began gathering materials for the signal fire-specific woods and plants that would create the smoke patterns she needed. Together, they climbed to the highest nearby point, a rocky outcrop that offered a clear view in all directions. The desert below was still shrouded in pre-dawn shadows, no movement visible for miles. "Good time," Kimmy said, surveying the landscape. "Air still. Smoke will rise straight." She worked quickly, arranging her materials in a precise pattern. When everything was ready, she turned to Emmett. "Watch for riders," she instructed. "I make signals, then we go quickly." Emmett positioned himself where he could see the approaches to their position, while Kimmy struck a spark into her carefully prepared tinder. The fire caught immediately, and she began manipulating the smoke patterns by alternatively covering the small blaze with a blanket and removing it in a rhythmic sequence. To Emmett's untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than puffs of smoke rising into the dawn sky. But he trusted that to those who knew the code, it was conveying specific information. After several minutes, Kimmy extinguished the fire completely, scattering the ashes to leave minimal evidence of their presence. "Done," she said. "Message sent. Now we wait for answer." They retreated to a position lower on the hillside where they could observe without being easily spotted. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, Kimmy scanned the distant ridges with intense concentration. "There," she said, suddenly pointing to a far peak where a thin column of smoke had appeared. "They answer. We'll meet at sacred place." Relief washed over her features, the first truly positive emotion Emmett had seen her express. For a brief moment, hope replaced the grim determination that had defined her since he cut her chains. They gathered their supplies and began the journey toward the meeting point Kimmy had indicated the night before. The route took them deeper into the hills, away from settled areas, and into rougher terrain. Kimmy moved with the confidence of someone returning to familiar ground, her pace quicker now that they had a definite destination. As they traveled, Emmett found himself thinking about the confrontation that likely awaited them back at his farm. By now, Malcolm would have returned, found the cabin empty, and realized they had fled. The search would be expanding, possibly with more men. "Will Malcolm be able to track us this far?" he asked as they paused to rest in the shade of an overhanging rock. Kimmy considered the question seriously. "Possible. He has trackers men who hunt Apache before." She gestured to the rocky ground they had been traversing. "But we leave little sign, and soon we be with Sierra Blanca's warriors." They know how to hide trail completely. The mention of warriors brought another concern to mind. These people we're meeting, will they welcome me, a white man? A shadow crossed Kimmy's face. Not welcome, but except for my sake, for blood oath. She met his eyes directly. You saved my life twice once after raid once at your fence. In Apache way, that creates bond, creates obligation. It wasn't the most reassuring answer, but Emmett appreciated her honesty. I'll follow your lead, he said simply. They continued their journey, the terrain growing increasingly rugged. By midday, they had reached a series of narrow canyons that cut through the hills like ancient scars. Kimmy led them through these with unwavering confidence, though to Emmett each turn looked identical to the last. The heat was intense, reflecting off the rock walls around them. Emmett felt sweat soaking through his shirt, and his water supply was running dangerously low. Kimmy seemed less affected, her body adapted to the harsh conditions of her homeland. Not far now, she said, noticing his discomfort. Water ahead. True to her word, the canyon soon widened into a small hidden valley, where a spring bubbled up from between rocks, creating a small pool surrounded by unexpected greenery. Emmett drank gratefully, the cool water reviving his energy. As he filled their canteens, Kimmy suddenly tensed, her head tilting as she listened intently. Emmett froze, scanning their surroundings for danger. Apache come, she said quietly. Many. Before he could respond, figures materialized from the rocks around them, at least a dozen warriors, their faces painted, for battle rifles and bows in their hands. They had approached with such stealth that even now, seeing them clearly, Emmett couldn't say exactly where they had come from. Kimmy straightened, raising her empty hands in what appeared to be a ritual greeting. She spoke in her native language, her voice clear and confident. The warriors listened without moving, their expressions unreadable. When she finished speaking, one man stepped forward, older than the others, with gray streaks in his long hair and lines of authority etched into his face. He responded in the same language, his tone questioning. A rapid exchange followed, with Kimmy occasionally gesturing toward Emmett or touching the pouch at her neck. The tension in the air was palpable, the warriors' eyes never leaving the white stranger in their midst. Finally, the older man, who Emmett assumed must be Sierra Blanca himself, made a decisive gesture. The warriors lowered their weapons slightly, though they remained vigilant. Kimmy turned to Emmett. They agree to hear us. Sierra Blanca knows of Starwalker, knows of Blood Oath. A hint of relief colored her voice. But we must go to their camp. Council will decide. Emmett nodded his understanding. He had expected nothing less, perhaps even feared a more hostile reception. I'll follow your lead, he repeated. The warriors formed a loose circle around them as they moved deeper into the hills. The path they followed was barely visible, winding through narrow defiles and across exposed ridges. Occasionally, one of the Apache would disappear, only to reappear minutes later from an unexpected direction, scouts Emmett realized, ensuring their passage remained undetected. Late in the afternoon, they descended into another hidden valley, this one larger and more verdant than the first. A small stream wound through its center, and along its banks stood a cluster of wickiups, traditional Apache dwellings made from brush and hides. Women worked around cooking fires, children played in the shallows of the stream, and horses grazed on patches of grass. It was a scene of ordinary life that contrasted sharply with the heavily armed warriors who had escorted them. These people, Emmett realized, were not just fighters, but a community and hiding families trying to maintain their way of life despite being hunted by men like Malcolm Thatcher. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Women gathered their children, men reached for weapons, and an air of wary suspicion fell over the camp. Emmett felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, assessing the threat he might pose. Sierra Blanca spoke sharply, and the tension eased somewhat. They were led to a larger wickiup at the center of the camp, where several older men and women were already gathering the council Emmett presumed. "What happens now?" he asked Kimmy quietly. "I speak of vision, of blood oath, of Little Dove's death." Her expression was solemn. "You speak of what you see at your land, of Malcolm Thatcher's evil." She hesitated. "Then council decides if they help." Before Emmett could ask more questions, they were ushered inside the wickiup. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight outside, and it took his eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, he saw that they were standing before a semicircle of elders, their faces etched with the wisdom and hardship of their years. Sierra Blanca took his place among them, then gestured for Kimmy to speak. What followed was a lengthy address in the Apache language delivered with such passion and conviction that Emmett could follow the emotional arc of it even without understanding the words. At certain points, Kimmy would touch the pouch at her neck, or gesture toward Emmett, or make the slashing motion that he now recognized as referring to Little Dove's murder. The elders listened without interruption, their expressions grave. When she finished, one of the female elders spoke, asking what appeared to be a series of pointed questions. Kimmy answered each one directly, her manner respectful but unwavering. Then, to Emmett's surprise, Sierra Blanca addressed him directly, in accented but clear English. "You white medicine man, why you help Apache woman? Why you fight your own kind?" All eyes turned to Emmett, waiting for his response. He felt the weight of their scrutiny, the justified suspicion born from years of betrayal and violence. He knew that his answer now would determine whether they received help or were sent away, or worse. "I'm not fighting my own kind," he replied carefully. "I'm fighting men who murder children and chain women to fences, men who would steal a sacred gift and use it for greed." He met Sierra Blanca's gaze directly. "Those men are not my kind, no matter the color of their skin." Sierra Blanca's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a measuring look, an assessment being recalculated. "You find Apache child buried on your land," he stated. "Why you not report to lawmen?" "Because the lawman's son is the murderer," Emmett answered. "And because she deserved better than to be evidence in a white man's court where her death would mean nothing." This answer prompted a murmur among the elders, though whether of approval or dissent, Emmett couldn't tell. Sierra Blanca raised a hand, and silence fell once more. "You know we plan to attack white man's ranch," he continued. "Many men could die, white men your people. You still help." It was a question Emmett had been asking himself since they left his farm. Was he truly prepared to take up arms against other settlers, against men he might have treated as patients in town? The answer came more easily than he had expected. "Henderson and Thatcher aren't just holding a child prisoner," he said. "They're trying to control water in a land where water means life or death for everyone. That affects my people too, the small farmers, the honest ranchers." He straightened, conviction hardening his voice. "Yes, I'll help. Not because I want violence, but because I'm a healer. And sometimes healing requires cutting out what's diseased." The medical metaphor seemed to register with Sierra Blanca, whose eyes narrowed thoughtfully. He conferred briefly with the other elders in their language, then turned back to Emmett. "We will decide. You wait outside." Emmett and Kimmy were escorted out of the wickiup. The sun was setting now, painting the hidden valley in hues of gold and purple. They were brought to a small fire at the edge of the camp and given food, a stew of meat and wild plants that Emmett found surprisingly flavorful after days of dried provisions. "Did I say the right things?" he asked Kimmy quietly as they ate. She considered this, her expression serious. Truth is always right thing. Counsel, respect, honest words. She glanced toward the central wiki-up where animated discussion could still be heard. But decision hard. Attack White Ranch. Bring great danger to people. Emmett understood the dilemma. Sierra Blanca's band had found a precarious safety in these hidden valleys. Mounting an assault on Henderson's property would risk exposing their location, inviting reprisals that could destroy their community. What if they refuse? He asked. Kimmy's face hardened with resolve. Then I go alone. Blood oath cannot be broken. The simple declaration held such conviction that Emmett didn't doubt her for a moment. She would walk into certain death rather than abandon her niece or violate her sacred promise. Not alone, he corrected quietly. We go. Surprise flashed across her features, quickly replaced by solemn gratitude. She didn't thank him aloud, but her slight nod carried the weight of deep acknowledgement. As darkness fell, completely torches were lit around the camp. Children were ushered into their family wiki-ups, and the atmosphere grew tense with anticipation. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the council's decision. Finally, after what felt like hours, Sierra Blanca emerged from the central dwelling. The entire camp gathered to hear his words. He spoke at length in Apache, his voice carrying authority and wisdom. Though Emmett couldn't understand the specific words, the reaction was clear, a mixture of grim determination and solemn acceptance. Warriors began checking weapons, women gathered supplies, and an air of purpose settled over the community. Kimmy turned to him, her eyes bright with fierce joy. They help, she said. Council agrees, Malcolm Thatcher and Henderson threaten all Apache, not just Starwalker. Threat must end. Relief washed over Emmett, followed immediately by the sobering realization of what was to come. They were committing to battle against armed men, men who would fight desperately to protect their ill-gotten gains and secrets. When do we move? He asked. Tomorrow night, Kimmy replied. Warriors, prepare now. Medicine made for protection. Scouts watch ranch to learn guard patterns. She gave him a measuring look. You should rest. Tomorrow comes soon, brings much danger. Rest seemed impossible given the circumstances, yet Emmett recognized the wisdom in her advice. They were offered a small wiki-up of their own with blankets laid on a bed of soft brush. The simple accommodation felt luxurious after nights spent on hard ground or cabin floors. As he stretched out, physical exhaustion began to overcome mental agitation. His last waking thought was of Clara and Lily, not with the usual ache of loss, but with a strange sense that they would approve of the path he had chosen. For the first time in years, he felt he was honoring their memory, rather than merely surviving it. Beside him, Kimmy sang softly a prayer, or blessing, he couldn't tell which. The gentle melody followed him into sleep, a promise of protection in the darkness that surrounded them both. Dawn arrived with a flurry of activity throughout the Apache camp. Warriors gathered around small fires, applying paint to their faces and bodies in patterns that Emmett recognized as both spiritual protection and practical camouflage. Women prepared bundles of food and medicine, their movements efficient and purposeful. Children watched with solemn eyes, understanding, without being told that something momentous was happening. Emmett woke to find Kimmy already gone from their shared wiki-up. He stepped outside into the cool morning air, squinting against the golden light that flooded the hidden valley. He located her near the central fire, deep in conversation with Sierra Blanca and several other warriors. Maps drawn in the dirt at their feet suggested they were discussing strategy. As he approached, Sierra Blanca acknowledged him with a slight nod. The suspicion in the chief's eyes had lessened, though not disappeared entirely. "Medicine man," he greeted Emmett. "We speak of tonight's plan." Kimmy shifted slightly, making room for Emmett in their circle. The map at their feet showed the rough layout of Henderson's ranch, the main house, barns, corrals, and outbuildings arranged around a central yard. "Henderson has 15 men," Sierra Blanca continued, pointing to various positions on the map. "Guards here, here, and here. Dogs by main gate. More men inside house." Emmett studied the layout, recognizing the tactical challenges it presented. "What about Starwalker? Where is she being held?" Kimmy answered, pointing to a spot beneath the main house. "Cellar beneath. Stone walls, one door with iron lock." Her face tightened with anger. "Malcolm Thatcher visits each day, makes her show where to dig for gold, where to drill for water." The thought of a child held prisoner, forced to use her gift for others' greed, kindled Emmett's anger anew. "What's the plan to get her out?" Sierra Blanca gestured to one of the younger warriors, who stepped forward eagerly. "Night Eagle is best scout. 3 days he watch ranch. See guards change, see doors open, see Malcolm come and go." The chief's weathered face showed a hint of pride. "Tonight, when moon rises, we attack from 3 sides." He traced lines across the map, indicating the approach routes. "Main force here draws guards to front. Small group here cuts horses free, starts fire in barn." His finger moved to the rear of the property. 3 warriors, and you 2 enter from behind, through stream bed. Night Eagle will guide to cellar door." It was a sound strategy, dividing Henderson's forces and creating enough chaos to allow a small team to penetrate to where Starwalker was held. Still, Emmett saw potential problems. What if she's not there? What if they've moved her? Sierra Blanca exchanged a glance with Kimmy. "She is there," Kimmy said with absolute certainty. "I feel her presence through blood oath. She waits, growing weaker, but still alive." Emmett had learned not to dismiss Kimmy's spiritual convictions. If she believed Starwalker was there, he would trust that. "And what about Malcolm?" he asked. "If he's there when we arrive, he won't give up easily." A cold smile touched Sierra Blanca's lips. "We hope he is there. Apache justice waits for him." The implication was clear. If Malcolm Thatcher fell into Apache hands tonight, his end would be neither quick nor merciful. Emmett felt a chill at the thought, even as a part of him acknowledged the justice in it. This was the man who had murdered a child in cold blood, who had chained Kimmy to a fence post to die, who had orchestrated countless atrocities against her people. Yet something in Emmett, the part that had taken the Hippocratic Oath, perhaps rebelled against the idea of deliberate cruelty even toward the deserving. "Justice, yes," he said carefully. "But remember, the priority is rescuing Starwalker. Revenge can come later." Sierra Blanca's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Emmett with renewed interest. "White man's mercy," he said, though without the derision the words might have carried. "But yes, child comes first. Justice follows." The council continued detailing the timing of the attack signals to be used and contingency plans if things went wrong. Emmett listened carefully, committing the details to memory. His role would be both warrior and healer, ready to fight if necessary, but primarily responsible for Starwalker's well-being once they found her. As the meeting concluded, warriors dispersed to continue their preparations. Kimmy remained beside Emmett, her expression thoughtful. "You disagree with Apache justice," she observed. It wasn't a question. Emmett considered his answer carefully. "I've seen too much suffering to wish more of it on anyone, even enemies." He met her gaze directly. "But I understand your people's right to determine Malcolm's punishment. I won't interfere." Kimmy studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable. "Healing hands," she said finally. even when they hold weapons, still healing hands. There was respect in her voice, perhaps even admiration. The day passed in a blur of preparation. Emmett checked and rechecked his revolver, cleaned his medical instruments, and packed bandages and medicines into a small bag he could carry easily. Kimi prepared her own weapons, a knife she had been given by one of the warriors, and a short bow with a quiver of arrows. Late in the afternoon, Sierra Blanca called the warriors together for a ceremony. Though not invited to participate directly, Emmett was permitted to observe as the men danced and chanted, invoking the protection of their ancestors and the strength of their traditions. Kimi stood apart, performing her own ritual. She had painted symbols on her face and arms, the same interlocking triangles and feather patterns that marked the blood oath. Around her neck, the leather pouch containing Little Dove's pendant and lock of hair seemed to gleam in the fading sunlight. When she finished her prayers, she approached Emmett with a small bowl of reddish paste. "For protection," she explained. "May I?" He nodded, and she dipped her fingers into the mixture, then drew lines across his forehead and cheekbones. The paste felt cool against his skin, with a tingling sensation that surprised him. "What is it?" he asked. "Sacred plants mixed with earth from ancestral grounds." Her touch was gentle, almost reverent. "Makes you harder for evil spirits to see. Makes bullets turn away." Though the rational part of his mind rejected such supernatural claims, Emmett found comfort in the ritual nonetheless. It was a connection to something larger than himself, a tradition that had sustained Kimi's people through generations of hardship. "Thank you," he said simply when she finished. She studied her handiwork with critical eyes, then nodded satisfied. "Now we are ready." As dusk fell, the attack party assembled at the edge of the camp. 20 warriors would form the main force with smaller groups assigned to the diversionary tasks. Emmett Kimi and 3 Apache warriors, including Night Eagle, the young scout, would make up the team tasked with finding and rescuing Star Walker. Sierra Blanca addressed them one final time, speaking in his native language, with occasional phrases in English for Emmett's benefit. The essence was clear: fight with courage, protect each other, bring the child home safely. When he finished, each warrior touched his outstretched hand in a gesture of solidarity and commitment. Last to approach was Kimi, who stood before the chief with quiet dignity. Sierra Blanca placed his hands on her shoulders and spoke words that, even without translation, Emmett understood to be a blessing or prayer. Kimi's eyes shone with unshed tears as she responded in kind. Then, without further ceremony, they moved out. The sun had set completely now, and darkness wrapped around them like a protective cloak. They traveled in silence, each group taking a different route toward Henderson's ranch. Emmett followed Kimi and Night Eagle along a winding path that descended from the hills into rougher terrain dotted with mesquite and cholla. The moon rose 3/4 full, casting enough light to navigate by without revealing their presence. Night Eagle led them with confident steps, occasionally stopping to listen or observe before continuing. The young scout moved like a shadow, his knowledge of the land evident in every sure-footed step. After several hours of travel, they reached the edge of a shallow arroyo, a dry stream bed that would lead them directly to the back of Henderson's property. Night Eagle gestured for them to wait, then disappeared ahead to ensure the way was clear. He returned minutes later with a nod of confirmation. "No guards in stream," he whispered. "Dogs at front only." They continued along the arroyo, crouching low to stay beneath its banks. The sounds of the ranch gradually became audible: horses moving in corrals, the distant barking of dogs, occasional voices calling to one another. As they drew closer, Emmett could make out the silhouette of the main house against the night sky, windows glowing with lamplight. Night Eagle held up his hand, signaling them to stop. Ahead, the arroyo widened as it approached the ranch property. The scout pointed to a small outbuilding approximately 50 yards away, the cellar entrance according to their intelligence. Now, they waited for the signal from the main attack force. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the tension building with each passing moment. Emmett checked his revolver one last time, ensuring it was loaded and ready. Beside him, Kimmy knocked an arrow to her bowstring, her body coiled like a spring. A sudden commotion erupted from the front of the property, shouts, gunfire, and the panicked whinnying of horses. The diversion had begun. "Now!" Night Eagle whispered urgently. They moved swiftly across the open ground, keeping low. Emmett's heart pounded in his ears, every sense heightened by danger. They reached the small building without incident. Most of Henderson's men had responded to the frontal assault just as planned. The cellar door was padlocked, but one of the Apache warriors made short work of it with a heavy knife. They slipped inside Night Eagle, leading with a small, covered lantern. Stone steps descended into darkness, the air below heavy with the scent of damp earth and fear. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a narrow corridor with a single door at the end, iron-bound oak, secured with another heavy lock. From behind it came the sound of frightened breathing. "Star Walker," Kimmy whispered, pressing her palm against the wood. "We come." The breathing hitched, followed by a small voice speaking in Apache. Kimmy responded quickly, her tone reassuring despite the urgency of their situation. While they conversed, the warriors worked on the lock. This one proved more resistant, requiring both strength and skill to break. Above them, the sounds of battle intensified, more gunfire, shouts of anger and pain, the crackling of flames as the barn diversion took effect. Finally, the lock gave way with a metallic snap. The door swung open to reveal a small, windowless room with a dirt floor and stone walls. A single lantern provided meager light, illuminating a pallet of blankets in one corner and a bucket of water in another. In the center of the room stood a small girl, perhaps 6 years old, her thin frame draped in a dress too large for her. Despite the dirt and fear that marked her face, the resemblance to Kimmy was unmistakable. The same high cheekbones, the same proud posture, even in captivity. But her eyes were startlingly different, a clear, bright blue that seemed to glow in the lantern light. "Star Walker," Kimmy breathed, dropping to her knees before the child. The girl stood frozen for a moment, disbelief written across her features. Then, with a cry that held both joy and anguish, she flung herself into Kimmy's arms. They clung to each other desperately, speaking rapid Apache through tears. Emmett watched the reunion with a tightness in his throat, reminded painfully of his own lost child. But there was no time for sentiment. They needed to leave immediately, while the diversion still held Henderson's men occupied. "We need to move," he said softly to Night Eagle, who nodded in agreement. Kimmy pulled back from the embrace, speaking urgently to Star Walker. The child looked up at Emmett with those uncanny blue eyes, studying him with an intelligence beyond her years. "White doctor," she said in halting English. "Healing hands." The words, so similar to what Kimmy had called him, sent a jolt through Emmett. Before he could respond, Night Eagle called from the doorway, his voice tense with warning. "Someone comes!" They extinguished the lantern quickly, plunging the cellar into darkness, broken only by what little moonlight filtered down the stairway. Kimmy pulled Star Walker close, shielding the child with her body. The warriors positioned themselves on either side of the door, weapons ready. Footsteps descended the stone stairs, a single person moving with confidence rather than caution. A voice called out, familiar and chilling. "Might as well come out. We've got your Apache friends surrounded upstairs." Malcolm Thatcher. Emmett exchanged a quick glance with Night Eagle, who signaled for silence. They would wait, let Malcolm enter the corridor, then ambush him from behind. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. A lantern beam swept the corridor, illuminating dust motes in the air. "I know you're here," Malcolm called, his voice deceptively casual. "And I know you've come for the little witch. Did her aunt send you, the one who escaped my hospitality?" Beside Emmett, Kimmy tensed at the mention of herself. Her hand went to her knife, but he placed a restraining touch on her arm. "Not yet." Malcolm continued down the corridor, the lantern light growing stronger as he approached. "Shame about all this commotion. We had a good arrangement going. The girl shows us where to find water and gold, and in return, she gets to live." A humorless laugh. "Better than her sister got anyway." At the mention of little Dove, Kimmy's control shattered. With a cry of rage, she lunged from the darkness, knife flashing in the lantern light. Malcolm reacted with surprising speed, dropping the lantern and drawing his pistol in one fluid motion. The shot echoed deafeningly in the confined space. Kimmy staggered, clutching her side, but her momentum carried her forward into Malcolm, driving both of them to the ground. The warriors rushed to join the fray, but in the cramped corridor, they couldn't get a clear shot or strike. Emmett pushed Starwalker behind him, drawing his own revolver. The lantern had rolled, casting wild shadows that made it difficult to distinguish friend from foe in the struggling mass on the ground. A second shot rang out. One of the warriors fell back, blood blossoming on his chest. Night Eagle shouted something in Apache, then leapt into the fight, his knife seeking Malcolm's throat. But Malcolm was a seasoned fighter, wiry and vicious. He threw Kimmy off with brutal force, sending her crashing into the wall. His pistol swung toward Night Eagle, who barely dodged the third shot. The bullet struck stone, sending chips flying like shrapnel. Emmett raised his revolver, searching for a clear shot, but the combatants were too entangled. He couldn't risk hitting Kimmy or the warriors. A fourth shot, Night Eagle cried out, dropping to one knee. Malcolm scrambled to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead where Kimmy's knife had caught him. His pistol now pointed directly at the wounded warrior. "No!" Emmett shouted, stepping forward. Malcolm's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the newcomer. "Callahan!" Surprise gave way to a cold smile. "Well, well, the good doctor's gone native, has he? Throwing in with savages." "Put the gun down, Malcolm," Emmett said, his own revolver steady despite the hammering of his heart. "It's over." Malcolm barked a laugh. "Over my father, and a dozen armed men are upstairs right now rounding up your Apache friends. Henderson's got another 20 hands coming in from the south pasture." His smile turned predatory. "No, doctor, it's just beginning." Emmett didn't lower his weapon. "Last chance, Malcolm. Put it down, or I'll put you down." "You don't have it in you," Malcolm sneered. "I know your type. Soft. Civilized." He spat the last word like a curse. Before Emmett could respond, movement behind Malcolm caught his attention. Kimmy had regained her feet, blood seeping between the fingers pressed to her side. Her eyes locked with Emmett's for a fleeting moment, a silent communication passing between them. "You're right," Emmett said, lowering his revolver slightly. "I am civilized, which is why I'm giving you a chance you don't deserve." Malcolm's smile widened. "That's what I thought." He never finished the sentence. With a swift, silent movement, Kimmy drove her knife into his back, the blade finding the space between his ribs with deadly accuracy. Malcolm's expression froze in shock, his pistol dropping from suddenly nerveless fingers. Kimmy leaned close to his ear, speaking low in Apache words Emmett couldn't understand. but whose meaning was clear from the cold fury in her voice. The blood oath was being fulfilled. Malcolm sank to his knees, then toppled forward onto the dirt floor. His eyes remained open, fixed on Emmett, in final disbelieving accusation. There was no time to process what had happened. Kimmy staggered, the strength that had carried her through the attack, now failing as blood loss took its toll. Emmett rushed to catch her before she fell, easing her to the ground. "Starwalker!" she gasped, reaching out for the child who stood frozen in the doorway of her prison. "Take her to safety." "We're all getting out of here," Emmett said firmly, already examining her wound. The bullet had struck her side, tearing through flesh, but missing vital organs. Survivable if the bleeding could be controlled. "Night Eagle, how bad are you hit?" The young warrior grimaced, pressing a hand to his wounded shoulder. "Can still fight," he replied through gritted teeth. The other warrior who had been shot lay motionless on the ground beyond help. Emmett made a quick assessment of their situation. 2 wounded, 1 dead, a child to protect, and unknown numbers of enemies above. Not good odds. "Is there another way out?" he asked Night Eagle, who nodded. "Drainage tunnel, behind child's room. Small, but we can pass." It was their best option. Emmett quickly bound Kimmy's wound with strips torn from his shirt, then did the same for Night Eagle's shoulder. Starwalker watched with solemn eyes, occasionally glancing at Malcolm's body with a mixture of fear and vindication that no child should have to feel. "Can you walk?" Emmett asked Kimmy when he finished. She nodded, though her face had gone pale beneath its natural bronze. "For Starwalker, I walk through fire." Night Eagle led them back into the small room where Starwalker had been held. He moved to one corner where a crude wooden grating covered what appeared to be a drain. With his good arm, he pried it loose, revealing a narrow tunnel just large enough for a person to crawl through. "Goes to river," he explained. "Water flows in spring." Starwalker went first, her small body easily navigating the confined space. Night Eagle followed, then Kimmy, with Emmett bringing up the rear. The tunnel was cramped and dank, smelling of mold and stagnant water. They crawled on hands and knees through absolute darkness, guided only by touch and the occasional whispered direction from Night Eagle. After what felt like an eternity, a faint light appeared ahead. They emerged onto the bank of a small stream well beyond the ranch buildings. The sounds of battle had diminished, suggesting either that the fighting had ended or moved elsewhere. Night Eagle scouted briefly, then returned with grim news. "Ranch surrounded. Henderson's men from South Pasture arrive. Many guns." "Our people?" Kimmy asked, her voice weak but determined. "Some escaped to hills. Others captured or killed." The young warrior's expression was bleak. "Sierra Blanca wounded but alive." It was better than Emmett had feared, but worse than he had hoped. "We need to get clear of the area," he said, supporting Kimmy, who had begun to tremble with shock. "Find a place to treat these wounds properly." Starwalker, who had been silent since their escape, suddenly spoke in rapid Apache. Night Eagle listened, then turned to Emmett with renewed purpose. "She knows place. Cave in hills not far. Water inside, hard to find entrance." He smiled slightly at the child. "Starwalker gift, she feels safe water." It was their best option. With Night Eagle guiding them, and Starwalker occasionally correcting their course, they made their way into the hills, avoiding open ground and keeping to shadows wherever possible. Kimmy leaned heavily on Emmett, her breathing growing more labored as they traveled. Just before dawn, they reached the cave. Starwalker had described a narrow opening in a rock face, almost invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the space widened with several chambers extending back into the hillside. As promised, A small spring bubbled up in one corner, providing fresh water. Emmett set to work immediately using the medical instruments he had carried with him. Kimmy's wound was his priority. The bullet had passed through cleanly, but she had lost a concerning amount of blood. He cleaned the entry and exit wounds with water from the spring, then stitched them closed with practiced hands. Through it all, Kimmy remained conscious, her eyes fixed on Starwalker, as if afraid the child might disappear if she looked away. The little girl sat beside her, holding her hand, and occasionally singing softly in Apache, a healing song Emmett guessed from the cadence. When he finished with Kimmy, Emmett turned his attention to Night Eagle. The warrior's wound was less severe. The bullet had grazed his shoulder rather than penetrating fully. It required cleaning and bandaging, but no stitches. By the time Emmett had completed his medical duties, the sun had risen fully outside their hiding place. All four of them were exhausted, hungry, and uncertain of what the new day would bring. "We should rest," Emmett said, organizing his instruments. "Kimmy needs time to recover before we try to move again." Night Eagle nodded agreement. "I will watch entrance. No one follows trail. Starwalker gift, hide us well." The young warrior positioned himself where he could observe the approach to the cave without being seen. Starwalker curled up beside Kimmy, their similar features even more apparent now that the child was cleaner and less afraid. Emmett settled nearby, his body aching from the night's exertions. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him. His mind kept returning to the cellar, to Malcolm's death, to the expression in Kimmy's eyes as she fulfilled her blood oath. He had come to respect and even admire this woman, yet there was a part of her, the part shaped by her people's traditions and the brutal realities of survival, that remained foreign to him. "You think of death," Kimmy said softly, startling him from his thoughts, "of knife in Malcolm's back." Emmett met her gaze, seeing no regret there, only a calm certainty. "Yes," he admitted. "Where I come from, a life is taken only in direct self-defense, or in war." "This was both," she replied simply. "He killed my sister, killed Little Dove, would kill Starwalker when no longer useful, would kill all Apache if could." Her hand rested on the sleeping child's head. "Blood oath demands justice." There was a logic to it that Emmett couldn't entirely refute. Malcolm had been a murderer many times over a man who had caused immeasurable suffering. Perhaps there was justice in his end coming at Kimmy's hands. "I understand," he said finally, "but I don't know if I could have done the same." A ghost of a smile touched Kimmy's lips. "That is why you heal, Emmett Callahan. Why your hands give life instead of take it." Her eyes drifted closed, exhaustion finally claiming her. Different paths, same journey. Emmett watched over her as she slept, reflecting on her words. Different paths, same journey. Perhaps that was true of all of them, Apache and settler, warrior and healer, each seeking their own way toward a future that remained uncertain. Outside their sanctuary, he knew the aftermath of the night's events would be unfolding. Henderson would be rallying his men, perhaps calling for reinforcements from nearby ranches. The sheriff, Malcolm's father, would be grieving and enraged, likely organizing a manhunt for those responsible. Sierra Blanca's band would be scattered, some captured, others in hiding. And what of himself? A white doctor who had thrown in his lot with the Apache, who had participated in an attack on a settler's ranch, who had been present at the killing of a deputy. There would be no going back to his quiet existence now, no returning to the small farm where he had buried his grief alongside his family. Yet despite the danger and uncertainty that lay ahead, Emmett felt a strange peace settling over him. For the first time since Clara and Lily died, he had acted with purpose, rather than merely surviving. He had used his healing skills to save lives, rather than just ease suffering. He had chosen a side in a conflict he had previously tried to ignore. Whatever came next, he would face it with the knowledge that he had done what he believed was right. Starwalker stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that made Kimmy's hand tighten protectively around her, even in unconsciousness. The bond between them was palpable, family found and reclaimed against all odds. Emmett thought of the photograph of Clara and Lily that he carried close to his heart. They were gone, and nothing would bring them back. But perhaps there were other kinds of family to be found, other bonds that could heal the wounds of loss. With that thought, he finally surrendered to exhaustion sleep, claiming him as the sun climbed higher above their hidden refuge. 3 days passed in the relative safety of the cave. Kimmy's condition improved steadily, her natural resilience aided by Emmett's medical care and Starwalker's constant attention. Night Eagle made brief scouting expeditions, returning with news of a massive search effort spread throughout the surrounding hills. Henderson offers gold for Apache scalps, the young warrior reported grimly. Sheriff, bring men from town to hunt those who kill his son. The news was sobering, but not unexpected. They would need to move soon, find a more permanent sanctuary before their supplies ran out or their luck failed. On the 4th morning, Night Eagle returned from his scouting with different news. Riders come, not hunters, Sierra Blanca's warriors, 6 men. Hope flared in Kimmy's eyes. Alive, Sierra Blanca lives, Night Eagle nodded. Wounded but strong. Leads surviving warriors to safe valley far north. The relief was palpable. If Sierra Blanca had established a new sanctuary, they would have a destination, a place where Starwalker could grow up among her people, where Kimmy could heal fully. The Apache riders arrived an hour later, approaching the hidden cave with the caution of men who knew they were being hunted. Their faces showed the strain of recent battle and flight, but also the determination of survivors. Sierra Blanca himself was among them, his arm bound in a makeshift sling, a deep gash healing on his weathered cheek. He greeted Kimmy and Starwalker with solemn joy, speaking words in Apache that brought tears to Kimmy's eyes. When he turned to Emmett, there was new respect in his gaze. "White medicine man, fight well, heal well," he said. "Apache people not forget." "What happens now?" Emmett asked, aware that his own future remained uncertain. Sierra Blanca's expression grew serious. "We go north beyond mountains, place white men not follow yet." He studied Emmett thoughtfully. "You come with us, Apache need good healer." The offer was unexpected and not without appeal. To start a new life among people who valued his skills far from the complications that now awaited him in settled areas. Yet something held him back, an awareness that such a path would mean forever cutting ties with his own culture, his own history. Before Emmett could respond, Kimmy spoke, her voice stronger than it had been since her injury. "Emmett Callahan has own path," she said, looking at him with understanding. "Not same as Apache path." Sierra Blanca nodded slowly, accepting this. "Then we help white healer find safe way, then go separate." The practicality of the solution was typically Apache acknowledging reality without sentiment. Emmett felt both relief and a strange sadness at the thought of parting ways with these people who had become against all odds something like friends. Preparations for departure began immediately. The warriors had brought additional supplies: food, water, medicine, and most importantly, horses. They would travel north by night using hidden trails known only to the Apache, until they reached the sanctuary Sierra Blanca had established. As dusk approached, Emmett found himself standing slightly apart from the others, watching as they readied themselves for the journey. Starwalker was laughing for the first time since her rescue. her small face alight with joy, as one of the warriors showed her a trick with a piece of string. The sight brought an unexpected ache to Emmett's chest, a reminder of Lily of childhood's resilience, even in the face of trauma. Kimmy approached quietly, moving more easily now, though still favoring her wounded side. She stood beside him in companionable silence for a moment before speaking. "You decide where to go," she asked. Emmett had been considering this question for days. "California, perhaps," he said finally. "It's far enough that news of Henderson's ranch and Malcolm's death might not have reached. I could start again, find a town that needs a doctor." Kimmy nodded, her eyes on the distant horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "Good land, they say. Much water, many plants for healing." Another silence fell between them, comfortable, yet tinged with the awareness of imminent parting. "What about you?" Emmett asked eventually. "Will you stay with Sierra Blanca's band?" "For now," Kimmy replied. Her people needs to learn Apache ways." A smile touched her lips. "But she also need to learn reading, writing, things her father's people know." The mention of Star Walker's father, the unnamed white soldier who had fathered her with Kimmy's sister, reminded Emmett of the child's unique position between two worlds. Like himself, perhaps she would never fully belong to either. "She'll need a guide," he observed. "Someone who understands both worlds." Kimmy's eyes met his, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "Perhaps paths cross again someday," she said softly. "Different trails, same mountains." Before Emmett could respond, Sierra Blanca called out, signaling that it was time to depart. The moment for farewells had arrived. Star Walker approached first, her blue eyes solemn as she looked up at Emmett. In halting English, she said, "Thank you, Doctor, for saving Aunt Kimmy, for helping find me." Emmett knelt to her level, deeply touched by the child's earnest gratitude. "You're very brave, Star Walker. Your gift is special, use it wisely." She nodded with a seriousness beyond her years, then impulsively threw her arms around his neck in a quick hug before darting back to the safety of the warriors. Night Eagle came next, clasping Emmett's forearm in the warrior's greeting they had shared in quieter moments. "Good journey, Emmett Callahan," he said simply. "May your eyes stay sharp and your heart stay true." One by one, the others offered their farewells, brief, dignified acknowledgments of what they had endured together. Finally, only Kimmy remained. She stood before him no longer the desperate prisoner he had cut from his fence, but a woman of strength and purpose. From around her neck she removed the leather pouch that contained the symbols of her blood oath. "This, for you," she said, placing it in his palm. "To remember, to protect." Emmett felt the weight of the pouch, the pendant that had belonged to Little Dove, the lock of hair, the scrap of cloth with its sacred symbol. "I can't take this," he protested. "Your oath." "Oath fulfilled," Kimmy interrupted gently. "Malcolm dead, Star Walker safe." She closed his fingers around the pouch. "Now new purpose. Remember those lost, protect those who live." The gift was deeply meaningful, a symbol of trust, of shared purpose across cultural boundaries. Emmett accepted it with the solemnity it deserved. "I have something for you too," he said, reaching into his pocket. From it, he withdrew a small brass object, a medical tool called a stethoscope, simple but effective for listening to the heart and lungs. "For healing," he explained, demonstrating how to use it by placing it against his chest. Kimmy took it with careful hands, her eyes widening slightly as she listened to his heartbeat. "Strong medicine," she said appreciatively. "Thank you, Emmett Callahan." Sierra Blanca called again, more urgently this time. The horses were ready, the first stars appearing in the deepening twilight. "Go with them," Emmett said. "Be safe." Kimmy's hand reached out, touching his face briefly in a gesture of farewell. "You also. Be safe. Be healer." Then she turned and walked to where the others waited, mounting her horse, with only slight stiffness from her healing wound. Star Walker was placed before one of the warriors, small hands gripping the horse's mane with the instinctive skill of her people. As they prepared to depart, Kimmy looked back one last time. No words were spoken, none were needed. In her eyes, Emmett saw gratitude, respect, and perhaps something more personal that would remain unspoken between them. Then, with a signal from Sierra Blanca, the group moved out, melting into the gathering darkness with the silent efficiency that had kept them alive in a hostile land. Emmett watched until they were no longer visible, the leather pouch clutched in his hand like a talisman. Tomorrow he would begin his own journey west toward California, and whatever future awaited him there. He would carry with him the memories of these days, the horror and the healing, the loss and the connection. Most of all, he would carry the lesson Kimmy had taught him, without words, that grief could be honored, without being imprisoned by it. That purpose could be found even in the harshest circumstances, that healing was as much about the spirit as the body. As the stars multiplied in the desert sky, Emmett turned away from the empty trail and began making his own preparations for departure. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. Different trails, same mountains. The Apache wisdom echoed in his mind as he worked a promise that paths could diverge and still lead toward shared horizons. For now, that was enough. The town of New Haven, California, 1883, Emmett Callahan stepped out of his small medical office onto the dusty main street, breathing in the crisp autumn air. A year had passed since the events at Henderson's ranch, a year of travel, of careful anonymity, of gradually rebuilding a life and practice in this growing community nestled between mountains and sea. New Haven suited him small enough to need a dedicated doctor, large enough that newcomers weren't subjected to excessive scrutiny. He had presented himself as a physician from back east, seeking the milder climate of California for his health. The town had welcomed his skills without asking too many questions about his past. He locked the office door, nodding to Mrs. Peterson, who was sweeping the boardwalk in front of her husband's general store. His modest reputation had grown steadily over the months, fair prices, competent care, and a willingness to treat patients regardless of their standing or ability to pay. "Evening, doctor," Mrs. Peterson called. "Heading home early today." "Special occasion," Emmett replied with a smile that still felt somewhat unfamiliar on his face. "Anniversary of sorts." It was though not one he could explain to the good citizens of New Haven, 1 year since he had cut the chains from a woman bound to his fence post, since he had chosen involvement over isolation, action over mere survival. The walk to his small house on the edge of town took him past orchards heavy with ripening fruit. California had indeed proven to be a land of abundance, just as Kimmy had said. He had even planted a garden behind his house, growing both familiar herbs and some of the medicinal plants she had taught him to recognize. His home came into view, a modest structure, but comfortable, with a covered porch and windows that caught the western light. As he approached, Emmett noticed something unusual, a small bundle placed carefully on the porch steps. Caution born of hard experience made him survey his surroundings before approaching further. The road was empty, the nearby fields deserted. Nothing seemed amiss, except for the mysterious package. Drawing closer, he saw that it was wrapped in leather, secured with sinew in a distinctive pattern he recognized immediately as Apache work. His heart quickened as he picked it up, feeling the weight and shape of something solid within. Inside his house, Emmett unwrapped the bundle with careful hands. It contained 3 items: a small pouch of what he recognized as healing herbs not native to California, a carved wooden figure of a horse, simple but beautifully crafted, and a scrap of paper with childish writing in both Apache symbols and English letters. "Starwalker learns 2 ways," it read. "Aunt Kimmy teaches both. We remember healing hands." There was no signature, no further message. None was needed. Emmett sat for a long time holding the gifts in hands that had once trembled at the memory of failure, but now remained steady with purpose. Somewhere to the east beyond mountains and desert, Kimmy and Starwalker were continuing their journey just as he was continuing his. Different trails, same mountains. Outside his window, the California sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, not unlike the Arizona desert, where his path had crossed with theirs. Emmett placed the wooden horse on his mantle beside the photograph of Clara and Lily, a bridge between past and present, between loss and renewal. Tomorrow, he would return to his practice, to the healing work that had once again become his calling. But tonight, he would remember the woman with the proud spirit who had awakened his courage, the child with blue eyes who embodied 2 worlds, the journey that had led him from despair to purpose. And perhaps, in the quiet corners of his heart, he would nurture the hope that someday their paths might cross again.